not actually my background, it's our head of BD's real background that I took a screenshot of when he was out of the room.
You should have just gone along with it.
I mean, yeah, man, like Sydney, surfing all the time.
Exactly.
How do I? Oh, God. Also outing myself. How do I make this full screen?
I think you can click the slideshow button, Amelia, at the top right.
Thank you. Cool. Should we jump into it?
Yeah, just let's do, and people will join in, or just watch those that we play.
Okay, fantastic. So thank you for joining, people that are in the call and watching on the stream later. In this call, we're just going to have a fireside chat between Ignatius and I about what ImmutableX is building for Web3 games on Starknet. So to start off, we'll do some intros. So I'm Millie. I'm a partner success manager for gaming here at Immutable with ImmutableX. So I look after our games in the Immutable studio, so Guild of Guardians, Gods Unchained, and then some of our other partner games like Planet Quest, Illuvium, etc., helping them to, think about how they can be like as successful as possible in onboarding the next billion users to crypto gaming. So Ignatius, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yep, thanks, Millie. So my name is Ignatius, and I am currently in the protocol team, so one of our product and engineering teams. The protocol team itself is broken down into two, so we essentially have a tokens team, and we also have a Starknet team. So I'm currently part of the Starknet team. Eventually, the Starknet team, if you guys read the blog post, there is a future where we want to go multi-rollup, right, beyond StarkX and Starknet, which I'll talk more about as well. But when that time comes, we'll transition into more of like a multi-rollup framework team, which I can also touch upon. But essentially, we will span that sort of framework layer across all rollups. So essentially, some of the questions that we try to answer as a team is, can our system scale to multiple different rollups, and can we essentially still provide the same level of experience and guarantees to our customers at that multi-rollup future? So yeah.
Nice, thanks, Ignatius. So that is the preamble. Let's get into the chat.
All right, so I will be asking the first set of questions to Millie. All right, so a bit of context that I'm sure everyone here knows is that we're currently in a bear market, right? And there was essentially a cycle where you go from bear to bull to bear. And so my question is essentially, what do you see, Millie, as the major Web3 gaming trends over the last cycle? And my second question is, which one do you think is most important that we should be aware of now in a bear market?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question for like especially the devs that are thinking about the Matchbox hackathon. So in the bull, we did see a lot of projects that were PFP or very low utility projects that did really well based pretty much entirely on hype and branding. So this spawned a lot of arguably questionable quality roadmaps with milestones like build, play to earn game, that indicated, at least to me, that the PFP projects were trying to build utility as an afterthought to games rather than building utility first projects. And this is something that like made a lot of sense in a bull market, because people were trying to like hype up their projects and say like, look, we're not just like a PFP, and there was lots of money going around, so these projects achieved adoption. There was also a lot of projects that had a high buy-in price with the promise of earning a lot of money, and they led to people grinding to earn money, but they weren't necessarily games that were fun to play. So I think of this as phase 0 in gaming, where games were directed primarily at a crypto audience. They had limited utility, high barriers to entry, and were financial first games, so like primarily ways of earning money. We're transitioning into what you could call phase 1 of the Web3 gaming industry. And this has been coming for a while, but it's definitely exacerbated by the bear because there's not the access liquidity for altcoins or NFTs that are essentially a buy-in for the game. So people are looking at like, how do we create more sustainable business models? The main kind of feature of phase one is that games are being built not just for these crypto audiences, so not just people that are like super crypto native looking to make a quick buck, but they're being built for mainstream audiences as well. So these are games that mainstream users can play and not even know that they're being run on the blockchain, because they're games that are primarily fun to play. So, utility first, and they have all the features that mainstream users expect, but they also give the benefits of crypto games. So they're games that have mainstream appeal, their NFTs have high utility, and they're free or very cheap to play. Then on top of that, they have the benefits that get people interested in crypto gaming in the first place. So users are able to have custody of their assets, they can trade external to the game economy, and they play and earn. So users can like earn income from the game if its tokenomics are designed effectively and sustainably. So that's kind of the trend from bull to bear. And I think that trend of like utility first games or like fun to play games has been coming for a while, but very much exacerbated by the fact that we're in a bear. In terms of what is the most important trend that we should be aware of, I think it's this concept of pushing for games that are able to, onboard the next set of users, so mainstream users into games. And that involves, a whole load of features, a whole load of like marketing, branding, tokenomics, like ways of thinking about a game. But onboarding mainstream users is definitely the biggest trend that I see.
Awesome, cool. And really, just to build on that, in this, I guess, play to earn future world that we're envisioning with mainstream adoption, what would you say are the major problems currently holding us back? And as always, I have a second question to that, which is, what do you think is the most important problem that we should solve as an industry?
Yeah, I think the main problems, and this is why I think of it as like, we were in phase 0 and we're now in phase 1, because some of these problems are kind of big and hairy problems that as an industry we're trying to solve, right? So like they're problems that potentially crypto like first users would be able to swallow, but like if we want to onboard the next billion mainstream users, we need to get this stuff right. So I think the most like there's kind of 3 that I would say. So the first is that there's like just a complex Web3 infrastructure. And this means that there's like a very slow time to market. So games can take years and years to build because they don't have the infrastructure like available to developers to build them in the same way that Web2 developers have. I think another issue is like there's constrained game economies. So games suffer from like liquidity being fractured across multiple chains, L2s and side chains, and then high fluctuating gas fees limit liquidity in a game. So if you're a mainstream user, you do not want to have to think about like an unknown fee that's going to be to buy your in-game item, because that's just not like that is not acceptable to you. So that's a major issue to adoption. And then the third issue is 100% security, and this is like the most important issue. Mainstream users will not accept the security issues that have been plaguing the crypto industry in the past couple of years. So we've all heard the stories of billions and billions of dollars being lost to vulnerabilities, notably the recent $600 million Axie hack. We've seen bridge and sidechain hacks, bugs in smart chain contracts, and entire blockchains collapsing basically. So this is a major hurdle that we need to overcome. And then on kind of a more granular level for developers, there's a whole range of primitives that need to be built out, and then battle tested with users, like in order to build successful games. So these are things like custodial wallets, having primitives that can facilitate crafting or forging in game, staking's obviously a massive one. In-game ERC20 swaps, like AMMs, NFT auctions, things like that. So this whole feature set needs to be built out so that developers can easily build these successful games.
Awesome. Thanks, Millie. Alex, I think we did cover that question as well, but do feel free to let us know if it hasn't. Awesome. Cool. Then those are all my questions. So I'll probably pass it on to Millie if you have any.
Yeah, I think so. I think I was kind of talking to the, like the trends and like what we see coming down the pipeline in terms of what ImmutableX is doing specifically. So how are we looking at solutions to these trends and problems? So IMX is on Starknet at the moment. How are we thinking about transitioning to Starknet to support these, phase one, fun to play and earn games?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So as you guys know, ImmutableX has been on StarkX, and that has worked really well for us in terms of providing very basic trading functionality, right? So if you guys have used ImmutableX before, you could essentially mint gas free, you could spot trade your NFTs, right? You could, deposit. We've got on ramps and off ramps as well, right? So you essentially have these like basic building blocks that a lot of different games and partners can essentially use to build and use within their gaming economy. Generally, we've seen that in phase 0, specifically, a lot of the project, like this suffices for a lot of projects and a lot of partners, right? So they essentially have their game economies and also more specific game mechanics and logic happening off-chain. And they essentially use us as sort of like an ownership settlement layer in order to exchange assets, have accounting for balances, ownership, and so on. Now, as Millie said, as you move to a phase 1 world, there are a lot more additional considerations that we have to make as well, and a lot more new primitives that we need to, and also the industry needs to provide for these games to be successful in a Web3 environment. And, some of them that Millie mentioned were, things like auctions, crafting, forging, staking, AMMs, and there are probably hundreds more as well. Commit reveal schemes are probably another one that are quite interesting. These ones, you could, right? Technically, you could build it on StarkX, but you would have to make compromises, right? StarkX is built as a very application-specific, high throughput system. But in terms of the level of composability and actually coding very like complicated custom logic for your game economy, it doesn't support that out of the box in a permissionless way, right? Which means you can't just write, as with on Ethereum, right? Just write your Solidity code, deploy it, and essentially just have that kind of manage itself in a way, right? The self-managing script in a way. So given this sort of constraint, and given, Starknet was inevitably the future of, ZK rollups and specifically from Stack with Stack, right? We decided to explore Starknet, right? So this is essentially when our transition happens to Starknet. Now, Starknet is quite young, as you guys all know. It was launched, I think, last November 2021 on the mainnet. And so there are, we're going through a couple of teething issues as a community. And in terms of standards for trading, this currently does not exist. Like there are a lot of different standards that are quite, siloed, but there's no like one sort of holistic standard that I guess all the community can kind of build on top of and essentially reduce these silos, right? Because if you think about it, if you got, Marketplace 1 building their own settlement contracts and you got Marketplace 2 building their own settlement contracts, these might not be directly interoperable, right? So you can't essentially cross settle these assets across different settlement layers or like settlement contracts specifically, right? And so Immutable's first phase essentially is to build the building blocks, right? So how do we trade? Well, we first need to do a couple of things, and that's essentially where we are at the moment. We've sort of gone close to the end of this phase at the moment. So this phase is essentially building things like, token standards, metadata standards, royalty for payments, bridging, to help you bridge assets from layer 1 to layer 2. If you guys have seen Arch, that's one example of a building block that we've designed and built. And really the goal here is essentially to create a set of ubiquitous standards that can facilitate the future of this play and earn model, which I can talk more about as well in terms of phase 2, and essentially allow this sort of very fluid trading experience, right? And how do we get to that level of fluidity is essentially where ImmutableX's platform layer comes into it, right? So you can now think of it as we build all of these base primitives on Starknet, right? And essentially ImmutableX sits on top of it, right? Sort of like a layer that essentially abstracts both StarkX, Starknet, right? So say you had a game that had, very simple gaming economy logic, asset ownership stuff. You could do that on StarkX, right? If you just wanted to do simple spot trading. And let's say at some point you want to extend that, and we have partners already speaking to us about this to do with, let's say, staking, where you essentially, compose an NFT within another NFT, or, like, let's say you've got an ERC20 that earns LP, right? Like sort of like an LP token, and it earns yield for you. You can essentially compose that with another NFT. There's sort of like more complicated, let's say logic to do with staking, crafting, forging, and all these kind of things. If you have that part in your gaming economy, you could use Starknet, right? ImmutableX and Starknet. And essentially, ImmutableX's goal is essentially to just abstract that user experience, right? So as Amelia touched upon, one of the biggest barriers to Web3 games is essentially, we want to use the blockchain for all these different reasons. We want to use it for having more logic and more of a gaming economy on it. But the user experience, the latencies, all these considerations for cost are quite a detriment, right? It's an obstacle for us to achieve that really smooth Web2-like gaming experience, right? And so, yeah, essentially where we are now is we've just passed phase 1, like close to the end of it. There are a couple of things we want to work on in terms of this layer 1 to layer 2 interaction to do with Arch. Then from that, we will eventually get into trading. So we'll start off with very simple spot trading and essentially create a more seamless experience between StarkX and Starknet, right? So the goal really, and there are no like exact timelines for this, but we want to create the ability for you to move your assets from StarkX to Starknet, right? And vice versa back if you so choose to, right? So we want to give you that optionality. So that would essentially be the next phase. And then the phases after that, we'll start to explore a lot of these new, more complicated, gaming primitives, like the one that we mentioned, Amelia mentioned previously. So things like auctions, AMMs, and so on. But yeah, I know that was a very long-winded answer, but hope that answers. I think you're on mute, Millie.
Bloody technology. Okay. So that kind of comes to the end of the prepared questions. So we've got one question from Alex that we're going to ask. Are there any other questions from the audience that we want to ask? If so, please pop them into the chat and we'll take a stab at them. So the first one is, what needs to be built for a more mature and better gaming ecosystem for gamers on Starknet? So e.g. marketplaces across games, etc. So I can talk about it from like a go-to-market point of view, and then I might jump over to Ignatius to talk about it from a tech point of view. But yeah, I think there's a lot of things that need to be built in terms of like a go-to-market point of view. So I think of marketplaces, especially like cross-game marketplaces, cross-protocol marketplaces, as effectively an acquisition tool for games. So if we, there's like a bunch of really great marketplaces, or one, market-leading marketplace that's built on Starknet, and they have good relationships with games, and they built an incredible marketplace that has good discovery and good like feature and good rarity indexes and things like that. Customers will go to that marketplace as a way to like discover new games effectively. And that can be like a really powerful acquisition tool and really powerful to drive adoption for these games. So yeah, I think, cross-game NFT marketplaces is going to be something that's really important. Ignatius, do you have a sense from the tech side what needs to be built for a more mature and better gaming ecosystem for gamers?
Yeah, I would say, I think the first thing is we always need the base layer of infrastructure to be built first. And I think that was what I was touching upon in terms of spot trading. But I think the big issue over here is essentially liquidity. And as you guys all know, liquidity is a cold start problem. And so it's very difficult for marketplaces and essentially anyone who's facilitating some trade or some discovery in order to get that amount of really high quality liquidity. And so I think one of the biggest things that we are trying to solve as a team is being able to leverage a liquidity that already exists on StarkX and essentially allow that to, carry over to Starknet as well, right? So we're essentially bridging the liquidity across. That essentially allows us to bootstrap and essentially create a more smooth, trading experience. Just very basic spot trading, right? I think in terms of what I've seen, commonly asked for on top of it, I think auctions is a very popular request as well, right? So essentially different variants of it are like English and Dutch auctions are, some examples for it. I would say another one would be staking primitives. Like this is also one of the top requested things. I've seen a lot of chatter as well in the community talking about staking. But essentially, yeah, like this is just having an ability or like a generalized staking primitive, right? That essentially any game or any content creator can essentially put their NFT in and people can start, using those NFTs to stake or like composing it in different ways. I think that would make the sort of NFT ecosystem much, much more powerful. And the really good thing about Starknet is, as you guys know, like it has one of the most, in my opinion, like rapidly growing and like really strong Web3 gaming ecosystems, right? So I think, if we all come together and create this sort of ubiquitous standard that a lot of these marketplaces can use, we essentially reduce these silos that exist, right? So we create a better gaming experience. These are not like overly complicated engines or any fancy trading or matching or anything. These are just really basic building blocks that, essentially we need to build and reduce these silos. So yeah, I would say auction staking, and the last one would be AMM. So I think that's another really key thing here, where essentially a lot of the games that I've seen have, starting to build more complicated game economies where they have multiple in-game currencies, and they essentially have this one reserve currency that acts as like a dollar, like a US dollar, like fiat within their economy. And just being able to essentially easily trade between these, right, swap between them in a balancer or even a two-token model, would be really powerful because it essentially reduces the friction to always have a specific currency when you ever want to trade your assets, right? So it opens up more optionality. So I would say that. And I think for the AMM side, another interesting variant over here that I've seen as well is like if you've essentially got individual NFTs at like the middle layer, you could essentially go like a layer above that where you have collections of NFTs, right? And these collections of NFTs could be grouped together in terms of like a property, right? Let's say if it's a trading card, it could be like an attribute of fire, water, or something. And you can essentially build markets around these things, right? Where essentially you'd no longer distinguish between NFTs, but you fungibilize them, create these sort of like AMMs based on the metadata, right? So that's a really interesting concept that I've seen floating around. And the sort of inverse of that, if you go one layer below that, you have these things like fractions, right? Where you can essentially assume an NFT is kind of like a company, and you've got like stock options that you can essentially divide up, and like that gets traded around. So a lot of interesting variants. We're exploring a lot of these things. And so there is also a call to action over here from our company is, if you guys have any requests for primitives, or if you guys see anything that's really important or really pressing for you guys to build like your own gaming, ecosystem or your own game itself, please do reach out, Discord or whatever, and we can have a chat about that.
Yeah, I totally echo what Ignatius said about like reach out. Would love to chat. We don't have very long to go. There's some really good questions coming through in the chat. I'm going to pick one again from Alex, which is that what in your mind will mean that Web3 gaming ultimately wins over current gaming models, and touches on the fact that the current emphasis is too much on work in like the current play to earn model. And so I can, answer that from my point of view, which is that Web3 gaming is going to win when Web3 games emulate all the things that mainstream games have, and then have the added layer of benefits that we see in crypto games. So combining like the best of both worlds. And I think it's something that's very achievable. Like at IMX, we're super passionate about it, and like is the future that we see for gaming. So there's kind of two things that I see that are really important to achieve this. One is having a mainstream look and feel to your game. So you can play the game and you don't even necessarily know that you're playing a game that lives on the blockchain. Once we get to that point, you know, like it's over for that. It's over for Web2 games, as far as I'm concerned. And then the second piece is around how do we effectively like leverage the benefits that come from Web3 gaming. So how do we create sustainable game economies? How do we get our tokenomics right? How do we like, you know, make sure that assets are self-custodial, all of those things. And once we get those things right, I think that's what's required for Web3 gaming to win. Do you have any other thoughts on that one, Ignatius?
No, I think that's a really good point. I think I would just add on a framing of this, which is essentially like all of these user experience issues, liquidity issues, immaturity issues, they're just limiting the user experience, right? They're like limiting factors for us to get a Web3 game into a Web2 game native experience, right? So, you know, these are not nice to haves. These are just like necessities in order to facilitate a better Web3 gaming experience. So yeah.
Yeah. Agreed. I think we probably have time for one more question. So Caleb has asked a couple of really good questions here. Both are spicy, so I'm going to pick one that I think is going to be interesting to the audience. So this one, like, what extent do you think in-game only tokens, i.e. not on chain, will play into play to earn or play and earn models? I've got some thoughts, but I'm wondering, Ignatius, if you want to take this one first.
So what extent do you think in-game only tokens, i.e. not on-chain, will play into play to earn and play and earn models? Yeah, this is an interesting question. I think I would say I guess it depends on how you would want to design your game economy around this. Like, I think there is a question of earn, right? And I think that the key here is an earn or to earn, right? And I think the ability to enforce that level of earning, right, is a question of essentially like it needs to be in some sort of, you know, permissionless environment, right? Like that needs to be enforced on some settlement layer. Now that doesn't mean that you couldn't have other currencies that revolve around it, right? Which is essentially like what I was talking about to do with in-game currencies outside of the reserve currency. Let's say you're earning object, or like let's say your earning object within a game is the reserve currency. Let's say it's gold or like the in-game gold. That gold essentially could be on-chain, right? It will need to be on-chain essentially. But all of the other currencies that essentially you could like trade back and forth with the gold can happen off-chain, right? So like, I guess there is a question of like, what do you really need to track the earning, the ownership, the exchange of value on-chain? And this question essentially goes with a lot of like just general development practices as well, right? Like, so even though we have Starknet, super scalable, like gives us very cheap computation and everything, there is still a question of what needs to be on-chain and what needs to be off-chain. So I think the same principle applies within the context of currency. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that one.
I'd agree with that. I think the only thing I'd add is like, I think there's definitely going to be a space for, especially in the, you know, until we get to that point where all of the features required for mainstream adoption are like built, battle tested, well adopted, etc. There's always going to be a space for like off-chain tokens. Like the current gaming industry has billions of dollars in in-game items and in-game currencies that live off, like not on the blockchain. So that's a use case that works, and we can see that has been adopted into a few like Web3 games, in addition to having an on-chain currency that has like an equivalent fiat value and can be bought and sold like external to the game. So I think in the interim, I think it's very likely that we're going to see games that have on-chain currencies that are like, you know, really exciting for crypto users or people that are interested in crypto, and then off-chain currencies that are used like in tandem in the tokenomics of the game. that mainstream users are going to be like mostly using. That's my 2 cents on that one. I think we are well and truly over time. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining, everyone who's watching the stream. Thank you, Ignatius. And thanks to the Matchbox team for organizing. If you've got any more questions, like want to chat further, please jump in the IMX Discord. We're always in there in the developer channel. We'd love to chat with you.
Thanks a lot for thanks also for this workshop. For sure. Like the replay will be recorded, will be online. Yeah, I think tonight. So yeah. Thanks a lot.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye bye.
Bye.